Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Fine. How are you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you for having this conversation with me.
No problem.
Thank you very much. Uh, I want to start with the misconceptions involving evolution. I start, I think, with using one, the one that you deal with your book. Evolution is just a theory. Can you explain why evolution is not just a theory?
Well, I mean, it's a theory and a fact. As I explain in my book, theory and science has a different meaning from what most people think of. I think that was used in um, in the debate last night between Bill Ham and between Ken Ham and Bill Nye. Certainly, some of the audience voiced that evolution is just a theory, implying it's a guess or a speculation.
Mm-hmm.
In science, a theory is a proposition or an explanation that purports to draw together a number of facts um, to explain a phenomenon. So we have the theory of gravity and the germ theory of disease, for example, the atomic theory,
Mm-hmm.
that matter is made of constituents called atoms. And nobody would call, atoms are facts. The germ theory of disease are caused by microorganisms, at least infectious ones, are facts. And in the same way, evolution, it's called a theory because Darwin proposed an explanatory schema for all these diverse facts, and that schema has turned out to be correct. So evolution, like the atomic theory and the theory of germ theory of disease, is both a theory and a fact at the same time. But a theory in the scientific sense that it's a well-established explanation for a diverse group of phenomena. And again, that's probably the most pervasive misconception about evolution, at least in America.
Yeah, I think you already answered my second question that you mentioned very clear in your book that theory of evolution is not just the statement that evolution happened, and includes the explanation why and how evolution happens.
Yeah. So, yeah, yeah, it's a statement of what has happened and why it's happened. Steve Gould made that pretty clear, although he thought that a theory was the explanation why and a fact was the thing itself. And, I prefer it's a matter of taste what you really call a theory, but it's not a matter of taste that the theory of evolution is something that has been confirmed as true over and over again. And that's what one should emphasize when you come up against this misconception.
But the word in theory of evolution can be used equivalent to the modern evolutionary synthesis.
Yeah, the theory of evolution, which I talk about in my book, that most people hold, is pretty much though the one that Darwin proposed, which involved the elements of evolution and its gradual transformation of populations genetically, although Darwin didn't know genetics, that there's splitting of lineages, so you get one species forming more. So we have a branching tree of life, and that gives the result that any pair of species has common ancestor. And finally, the sort of designoid part of that process, where organisms look like they're designed to fit their environment, is a result of natural selection. So that's the Darwinian theory of evolution. The neo-Darwinian theory that's based on genes that are particular ones in the organism. There's other processes like genetic drift. Um, we can have some horizontal gene transfer.
Mm-hmm.
That those are add-ons that aren't particularly. They're important and they've been confirmed as true. But for the average person who disbelieves evolution, what they're disbelieving is those five propositions I just outlined.
And what do you think is the most common misconceptions of evolution? We have dealt a lot with that, especially in America. I think the research.
Well, the main one is it's just a theory, a hypothesis. Another one is that it involves instantaneous. This is particularly common amongst young people, children, that it involves an instantaneous transformation in populations. Like every individual turns into something else, rather than the gradual genetic
Mm-hmm.
change in the composition of populations. There's been research on misconceptions of evolution. I can't, excuse me, parrot all the results, but that's a big one. Another one is that there's not much evidence for it. We don't have, you know, the evidence for one type of animal turning into another one over time. That Ken Ham said that in his debate last night. He said, where's the supporting evidence? And in fact, there's lots of evidence people just don't know about. So there's other misconceptions as well that are sort of connected with politics, that it leads you to believe in eugenics or racism or give up God. But those may be true in some cases, particularly the last one. I mean, I don't think evolution intellectually leads people to racism or eugenics. I think it does, like all good science does. It causes people to sometimes question or abandon their religious beliefs, but that's not really part of the theory itself. That's just a result of the sort of education and doubt and evidence that you get when you learn about evolution.
Mm-hmm. I put over here that I think one of the misconceptions that, for example, evolution is a random process, or even the
Oh,
definition.
yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I should have mentioned that. How can all this happen by chance? That's easily dispelled if you understand what natural selection is, but it's very, very common. Oh, another one is, well, then I mean, in America, it's connected with all kinds of religious things. So if you believe in evolution, then you have to give up your morality. That's probably the main reason why religious people oppose evolution in America, and maybe in Brazil as well, because it's a religious country. That what basis do you have to be moral if you're just an evolved animal like a chimpanzee? And that's a misconception as well, because it comes from a misunderstanding of where morality really comes from. So.
The other one is, I think you're reading about that in a blog recently, is about the meaning of the word random when you talk about mutations, random mutations.
Yeah, although people don't. Yeah, I mean that connects with what you said before. That how can it all happen by chance? I mean, people aren't really sophisticated enough to know, the average person to know that mutation is a random process, and even less of them would know what we really mean by a random process. But which is that it happens. The occurrence of mutation is indifferent to its effects on the reproductive output of its carrier. So that's mostly a misconception amongst more sophisticated creationists. And I don't even think it's a misconception. I think it's a deliberate,
all right.
I can't say lie because I've changed my mind about whether creationists are lying or not, at least the famous ones. It's something that they say to make people question evolution, which is their mission. So.
Okay. And what about the missing link? Everyone wants to critics mix denial of evolution because you don't have a specific missing link, but transitional form of. If you can remember, you deal a little on your book, and even one of the chapters of Richard Dawkins' books about evolution is the missing link, because you're going to have a lot of missing links. It's not just one.
Yeah, but there's a misconception about what a missing link really is. Missing link between humans and chimps would be the common ancestor between humans and chimps. And that's a single species that split into two populations, one of which gave rise to all hominins, and the other which gave rise to all, the bonobos and the chimps. And, we're not going to find in general a single species in the fossil record, but that you don't need that missing link to prove that humans and chimps have a common ancestry. What you need, as I said in my book, is if you go back earlier and earlier in the human lineage, you expect to find more and more transitional forms that show an ape-like ancestry. And in fact, that's what you find. And we have those not for humans. I mean, Ken Ham made this and said the same statement in the debate last night. We have these separate kinds, and we have evolution within kinds, which a lot of creationists will admit. Dogs will evolve into other dogs, like the hyena and the wolf and the fox, but you never see a dog evolving into a cat. So that's what. Yeah. But if you look in the fossil record, that you see these transitions between. You see Tiktaalik, which Bill Nye mentioned, which is a transitional form between fish and amphibians, and you have them between amphibians and reptiles, the reptiles and mammals, the so-called mammal-like reptiles. I mean, there's a very good fossil record there. We have them between reptiles and birds. What a great collection of transitional forms we have in the feathered dinosaurs. Between whales and their terrestrial ancestors, we have these sort of swimming cetacean-like things, but they have hind limbs that are about this long, that have femurs and tibias and humeruses, and of course all the transitions in the human lineage itself. So, I mean, we're faced with an embarrassment of riches. We have not only the links between major types of animals that are predicted by the theory of evolution and weren't known in Darwin's day. None of these were known in Darwin's day. They were predicted. And there are also the links between the so-called different kinds that the biblical creationists say could not exist. So, those kinds of fossils absolutely dispel any kind of creationism at all.
Yeah. What about? I think that's one of the misconceptions common by creationists that use says that evolution does not explain. I mean, some the wing or eye is too much complex and uh, cannot appear by gradual changes over the time, and it's a too complex things.
Yeah, well, the eye is, I mean, the eye example is now pretty much brought forward. First, I mean, Darwin was the first one to deal with it in The Origin, showing that we have all degrees of eye development in living species, and there's no problem in envisioning how you would go from one to another. And second, we have this paper by Nilsson and Prager, published in, I think, the Proceedings of the Royal Society, where they made a simple model of the evolution of a complex camera eye from a light-sensitive eye spot like you'd have in planaria worms. And they made very conservative assumptions about what the mutation rates might be, what the selection pressures are. And in only like 86,000 generations, they saw this eye spot evolve into a complex eye. So we have two kinds of evidence that dispel the idea that the eye is too complex to evolve. We have a sequence of eyes in living creatures which you could plausibly connect, showing how they could string up. And second of all, we can make the process happen through computer simulation using conservative assumptions. So, that old canard that the eye could not have evolved because science could not think of a plausible way it could happen has been refuted in two ways, computer simulation and observation of the natural world. And that goes for every complex feature. I mean, blood clotting is another one, which the intelligent design people use. I mean, how could you get this complex cascade of enzyme reactions that result in a blood clot? You know, it couldn't possibly have evolved because if you take any intermediate step, the blood won't clot. So it's all got to be there, and God did it. But then, research showed that you can knock out in mice certain intermediate steps, and you still get a clot. So you can plausibly build up this sequence of enzymatic activities through. I mean, we don't know how it happened because we weren't there. But that you don't need to actually have observed it to reject the creationist argument that it's too complex to evolve. All you have to show is that you could make a plausible scenario whereby each step has an adaptive advantage to show that its evolution was plausible. And that's all you need. And we've done that for almost all of these traits that are supposedly non-evolvable and too complex, and therefore must have been the result of God. So.
From my perspective as a reader, I think there is I guess a bit controversy about the unit of selection, the target of selection. I mean, one of the first book I read was Selfish Gene, and it's focused on the gender view of evolution, centered on the gene. But Ernest Mayer, I think he was a little bit critical of this view, and I want to know today what is exactly a current view, a widespread view, accepted view of what is the target of selection.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you use the words target of selection, you're sort of anthropomorphizing the process because selection is not some force that's out there that has target. Yeah, I mean, that's just shorthand. So what we mean is what is the unit whose differential reproduction causes evolution? And I think Dawkins is generally right. And in almost every single case that we know of where we can reconstruct what happened and see what the basis of an evolutionary adaptation is, it's basically the gene itself. We see a change in a gene, like look at antibiotic resistance in bacteria or insecticide resistance in insects. Let's take that last case. So, it's resistance to organophosphate insecticides. And in many cases, it's the same gene that we know because we can localize where the lesion is in the gene that's actually causing insecticide resistance. And I think it's a mutation in a detoxification enzyme, I think an esterase. And in many cases, it's the exact same mutation in different insects. So that and many other cases where we've actually managed to localize, where selection has actually started. It's on a genic level. But that said, I mean, there are conceivably other sort of targets of selection. Um, um, the group selection, many people have said, is a plausible alternative. That is, that groups, it's the group that has the differential reproduction. I mean, that's been used to explain everything from the evolution of altruism to sex. The problem is that we don't have evidence. Well, first of all, the group selection is intrinsically less than individual reproduction because groups don't proliferate and go extinct nearly as fast as individuals do.
Hmm.
And second of all, we don't know, or I can't think of a single adaptation which is good for the group but bad for the individuals in
Individual.
the group, which you would expect to see if group selection could occur and override individual selection. Now, so I think pretty much, Dawkins is pretty much right. The target of selection, or at least the thing that has to change to cause evolution, is the gene. But of course, it does that by affecting the reproduction of the individual who carries that gene. So in that way, you can conceive of the target of selection as the individual. And the way that's resolved is to think of the gene as the replicator, and the individual whose reproduction is affected by interacting with the
Uh,
environment as the vehicle for the gene. So,
yeah, I will mention that, and but I think what Stephen Gould said, or Dawkins said, the view of Gould is that the gene is just some sort of recorded what had worked better than not. The gene is some sort of passive.
well, I don't know what you mean by passive. I mean, the gene does create through the process of development these phenotypes that reproduce differentially. So, and the fact that those bodies die off at different rates or reproduce at different rates affects the gene. So ultimately, you have to have the gene is sort of the bottom line, the gold standard for most evolution, as far as I can see. I mean, if you don't, and the proof of that is if you have lots of clones of an individual, they're going to be different phenotypes. Like if you clone a plant and you plant it in the field, so everybody's genetically identical, and then you start, but they have different phenotypes because some plants will be in good places, some will be in bad places, some will be taller. If you select for bigger plants, you're not going to get a response. There's going to be no evolution because the genes are all the same. So you've got to have those genetic differences in order
To
to
have
have it.
evolution.
Yeah, even if the phenotypes differ and they reproduce differentially, that's not going to cause evolution unless that differential reproduction is caused by different genes that are in those bodies. So
But Mayer is a little bit, I think in his book, What is Evolution? And he's a bit against the definition of evolution that is a change in the gene frequency. He said evolution it's not that. It's a change in individual population. I don't quite record the definition he uses, but he was a little bit critical of saying the evolution is a difference in gene frequency.
yeah, well, I would, it's largely comes down to a semantic problem.
Yeah, I know.
Most people think of evolution as an observable change in an organism over time, like
Yeah.
dinosaurs evolving into birds. But of course, that means that there's been a change in the frequencies of the
Of the
genes
genes.
and stuff like that. So, it's all how you choose to look at things. I prefer to look at it as a change in gene frequency because you can have changes in phenotypes over time that aren't what we would call evolution. I mean, the Japanese population has increased, I think at least 6 inches in height since the war. Because that's an improvement in nutrition since World War II. I don't think we'd call that evolution. Um, there's two ways to look at evolution. Some people would because they just think of evolution as change. But if we're talking about biological evolution, which is what we're talking about now,
Yeah.
I think ultimately you have to take that back down to gene frequencies because the Japanese population increase in height is not an example of biological. Yeah, it's a change in bodily form, which is due to improvement in nutrition, and it would be confusing to call that evolution. I think Meyer was a bit hung up on semantics there because, after all, Meyer explicitly admitted this to me. I don't know anything about population genetics, so he'd prefer a definition that comports more with his
All right.
area, which is looking at phenotypic change. So
Yeah, you had mentioned the importance of other mechanisms than natural selection. I want to exactly know, I mean, how is important this mechanism. I know there's genetic drift and
mhm.
sexual selection, but how the importance in the context of evolution?
Well, sexual selection is natural selection. I mean, it's just a specific form of natural selection that involves mate choice.
Yeah.
So I don't break that off um, from natural selection.
All
Although
right.
people have tried to do that, like I think E.O. Wilson has tried to call that a separate evolutionary process, but it's not. It's really the same thing. Genetic drift. I mean, really, well, there's really only two other evolutionary processes that I can think of. One of which is genetic drift, which is a random change in the frequencies of genes due to
Numbers of offspring.
stochastic reproductive differences, differences in sex ratio, differences in the number of offspring that don't have anything to do with fitness. And so the question is, how important is that in evolution? That's in fact a question that I like to ask graduate students in their qualifying exams. And the answer is that it's probably important in molecular evolution because there's lots of characters in molecular evolution that are, whose change don't affect the fitness, like changes in the third positions of codons, of the triplet codons. There's lots of parts of the DNA that don't do anything, the so-called junk DNA. And so the, genetic changes in those regions are probably going to evolve only by genetic drift because they can't possibly affect the reproductive output of the carriers. Um, and so I think it's important in molecular evolution. We can actually show that because the molecular clock, the sort of linear change in the genetic composition of certain parts of genes over time, is exactly what's predicted by genetic drift. And it's exactly what we see in many parts of the genome. We also predict from genetic drift that the non-functional parts of our DNA are going to evolve faster than the functional parts because they're not constrained by selection and genetic drift. That's exactly what you see. These pseudo genes and junk DNA are the fastest evolving things that we have. But in terms of evolution of the phenotype, so the student might say that, and I'll say, okay, give me an example of an observable trait of an organism that's evolved by genetic drift, and there they get lost because there aren't really many for two reasons. First of all, it's hard to prove in any given case that a trait evolved by genetic drift rather than selection, given that a tiny selective advantage can cause change over millions of years, and you can't measure that in real time. So, I guess the high frequency of some deleterious genes in populations like relic human populations, like the Dunkers and the Amish, the high frequency of disease genes in Ashkenazi Jews, that can probably be attributed to genetic drift as well. But it's hard to give an example of that process operating on the level of the observable traits of organisms. It probably operates. We just don't have many good examples of it. The third case is meiotic drive, which I suppose you could think of as natural selection, where you have two different copies of genes. Genes come in pairs, and one of them is a mutant copy that kills the other one. So when it comes time to make eggs or sperm, this copy A here simply drives the one out by killing it. It's a very interesting phenomenon. So it gets represented in the next generation. But you can think of that as kind of selection as well. So I would tend to, although it's non-adaptive selection, it's differential reproduction of the gene. It doesn't make its carrier any better fit. In fact, it could cause populations to go extinct. But I would still count that as natural selection. So really the two big forces of evolution are the deterministic force of natural selection and the random force of genetic drift. Yeah.
You had mentioned about junk DNA, so I'm going to jump on that question that I think if you accept the view of the gene-centric view of evolution, explanation why the junk DNA is there, I think it's intuitive for me. I mean, DNA doesn't do anything, but he's there because he's, well, it's a little bit economic to not do anything, but still there. It's not being eliminated by natural selection, by any kind of selection. And
well, it would be if it were bad. I mean, actually, some of this junk DNA represents viruses and transposable elements that have come in from the outside. And there they have been inactivated by selection. But once they're inactivated and they're sitting there in the DNA, then you have to ask, well, what is the advantage to the organism of eliminating that? And there really isn't much. I mean, what's the cost of having extra DNA? Well, it has to be replicated when you reproduce. So, but that's a tiny cost compared to, so, and it could be that a lot of this junk DNA is being weeded out, but it's so, the, the disadvantage of having it is so small that it will be weeded out very slowly. Or the disadvantage of having it is so small that it would be outweighed by genetic drift, because selection and drift can oppose each other. And if a trait is bad, but it's not very bad, in fact, if its badness is less than the reciprocal of the effective population size, that's our population genetic formula, then it won't really be affected by selection at all. It'll just bounce around as if it were a completely innocuous neutral trait. So that may be, the fact why this junk DNA stays around. Maybe have a very, very tiny bad effect on our DNA because it costs at metabolic effort to replicate it. But it's so small that it's not even seen by natural selection, and it just hangs around. There's a big argument about whether we have even junk DNA, the encode sequence thing. I think the evidence is coming out now that yes, a lot of that DNA really is non-functional. That encode project, which was published in Nature, saying that our junk DNA really does stuff. That there are flaws in some of that analysis.
Right. And what about the evidence of evolution? I mean, many people think that the only evidence you have is from the fossil record, but if you don't have fossil record, evolution still be true for scientists.
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear what you said.
Okay, I asked about the fossil record. If we don't have a fossil record, evolution would still be true. We still have other ways to corroborate evolution.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dawkins has made that point, that we have, you're asking, do we have enough evidence from other areas that we could document evolution without a fossil record? And the answer is yes, we could, because of all the, the DNA evidence that we have showing organisms are related, the embryological data that only makes sense in evolution, the biogeographic data, which I describe in my book, is very, very powerful evidence for evolution. Vestigial organs, the existence of vestigial genes, like the human genome has genes for making egg yolks, and yet we don't do it. I mean, those genes are inactivated. Now, how do you explain that unless we evolved from an organism that originally did make egg yolks, which we did? So, I mean, scientists would still have very firm belief in evolution. And of course, Darwin, his contemporaries, without any fossil evidence whatsoever, based on the kind of stuff I just talked about, embryology, biogeography, the efficacy of artificial selection as a parallel to natural selection. And so, after 10 years after Darwin, almost every biologist and rational layperson accepted evolution, and yet there was no fossil record that actually showed evolution. So the fossil record is really sort of icing on the cake for us. But for many people, that's the stuff that's the most convincing. When you can really show them a feathered dinosaur, that kind of evidence is really very powerful than just showing that, birds have certain vestigial traits from reptiles and stuff. So, in terms of what really hits home to people, the fossil record is a very powerful way of doing that. Yeah.
Oh, I'm moving a little science and religion problem. We have dealing with that a little bit, and I want to know the problem with religion in the context of evolutionary teaching. I mean, how is the impact of that? And I think it's more important. How can we solve this problem?
Well, you mean the problem of you're talking about the incompatibility between science and religion?
Yeah, I'm talking a little bit about that, but at this moment in the context of how religiosity undermines evolution or makes a barrier to understand it correctly.
Yeah, well, in your country, it's a lot less of a problem than ours.
Yeah, I think it is.
Okay, your country is Catholic.
Yeah.
And Catholics, the official position of the Catholic Church is that evolution is okay. Now, there's still a problem with the Catholic Church because they have some positions which are explicitly anti-evolutionary, and one of them is that Adam and Eve were real people. I mean, that all of us are descending from Adam and Eve. And we know now
Mm-hmm.
that the human population of ancestral modern humans could not have been smaller than about 2,000. We knew this from population data. So this is causing a great uproar amongst evangelical Christians in the U.S. because it not only undermines Catholicism, it undermines any form of Christianity whose belief depends on that Jesus came back to save us from original sin committed by Adam and Eve. If Adam and Eve didn't exist, then there was no original sin, and then so what's the point of Jesus? So, in that way, Catholicism is deeply undermined by evolution. Catholics also think, and the Pope has said this, that humans are different from other creatures because God gave us a soul. At some, and okay, where is this soul? When did it come into the human lineage? What's the evidence that it exists? And there isn't any. So, I mean, this is called theistic evolution. And
it would be my next point because I think the Catholics makes a lot of the point. They say they accept evolution, but they only accept evolution is guided by God.
Yeah, and I don't consider that. I mean, so humans are the exception, right? So you can say, well, Catholics are down with evolution. I mean, this is American jargon. Down with means agrees with. Catholics are down with evolution, except for two things: that God had a hand in the human evolution, and that human evolution involved Adam and Eve. I don't consider that. I mean, if you accept science, but then you reject it in those areas where it conflicts with your faith, then I don't think you're behaving fully scientifically.
Yeah.
So I think that the Catholics' position on evolution, while it's better than that of, say, an American Baptist, still is opposed to science because it gives up on the science at the point where that science comes in conflict with the Catholic dogma. And that's not a good way to behave because it prioritizes faith over evidence, over rationality. In the US, it's much worse because 46% of Americans just reject evolution, period. They're young earth creationists. And that's because our country is religious, probably more religious than yours, but religious in a different way because they're not Catholics. They're largely Protestants. And a lot of those Protestants simply don't believe in evolution. By the way, 23% of American Catholics don't accept evolution either. They're young earth creationists. They violate the tenets of their own church because, evolution has a number of psychological effects on people that are uncomfortable. And so even if your church says it's okay, you might oppose it because it makes you feel bad in certain other ways.
Yeah, and you mentioned that more generally the incompatibility between science and religion. Have to deal with that.
Sorry, have what?
The incompatibility between science and religion. I mean, you made explicit that science and religion are incompatible in the methodology.
Yeah. So you want me to explain that, or
yeah.
I'll try to do it briefly because I'm actually writing a book on it. That's the point. What I mean by incompatible is not that scientists can't be religious, because that's obviously true, that there's lots of them that are, Francis Collins, or that most religious people don't accept science, because they do. Even, Bible-beating American Southern Baptists are going to generally accept most of science. They're going to accept, physics and chemistry and medicine and stuff like that. What I mean when I say incompatibility is that the methodology that science uses to find out things that are true about the world is in exact opposition to the methodology that religion uses. And that's based to find out truths about the world. And that claim rests on my contention that religion does make factual claims about the world. And I can document that. I mean, Catholics, just read the Nicene Creed, which Catholics recite in church every Sunday, to see a list of factual statements that Catholics believe in, that Jesus was their Savior, that he was the Son of God, that he died and was resurrected, that he's going to come back and we're all going to have afterlives, except for the bad ones that are going to burn in hell. I mean, those are all real statements about what is true about the cosmos, that it's being overseen by some bodiless mind that's going to do this to us, that has a personal relationship with us, who hears our prayers. I mean, some of that is hard to test, but some of it you can. But, the scientific attitude towards a lot of that is, I'm not going to believe it until you show me the evidence. I mean, prove to me that there's a heaven. And you can't. So the way a scientist would say, well, since there's no evidence for heaven, I'm just not going to accept it. It's not saying I know that there is no heaven.
Mhm.
When you're an atheist like I am, you don't say I know there is no God. That's an unscientific attitude. What you would say is I don't see any evidence for God, so I'm not going to accept that.
Mhm.
It's just the same way that people say, well, I don't see any evidence for fairies or elves or leprechauns, so I'm not going to accept that. And everybody's like that when it comes to God, and there's
God.
that same lack of evidence. Instead of saying, well, I'm not going to accept it, they say, well, it could be true. We just don't know. But the scientific attitude towards claims about what's true in the cosmos demands evidence. It demands consistent evidence that everybody agrees on that. It demands testability, either observational or historical, and doubt and replication. And that's all true of science, but none of it's true of religion.
Religion.
And so the ultimate proof that religion doesn't really tell us what's true about the cosmos is that we have over 10,000 different religions that make different claims about the universe that are conflicting. Muslims think that if you see Jesus as your savior, you're going to go to hell. Whereas a Baptist is going to say if you're a Muslim and you don't accept Jesus as the prophet, you're going to go to hell. I mean, there's no way to comport those. And all the religions of the world believe different things. Now, if faith, and dogma and authority were the correct way of finding out the truth about religious matters, then all religions would have the same tenets. So the fact is that faith, dogma, and authority, which is the tools that religion uses to find truth, can't find truth. And that means that the truth finding antennae of religious people are incompatible with the truth finding antennae of a scientist. And that's what I mean by incompatibility.
And you're critical of accommodationism, and you have said
Yeah.
that it does not work. And first of all, I'm also critical of accommodationism. That's the reason we're talking in the first place. I want to know why you have this position and why it does not work.
Well, I mean, look at one example of why it doesn't work is how the Catholics are accommodationist. Catholics are one of the most science-friendly faiths around, and they accept evolution. But there's certain things that they have to accommodate with that, and one of them is the Adam and Eve thing, right? So we have this problem that the Bible says of Adam and Eve existed, and they were the cause of the original sin that Jesus came back to help atone for. Okay, how does the Catholic Church accommodate that? It doesn't. It basically says our dogma is that Adam and Eve were real people that gave rise to ancestry. And that is in direct conflict with what the scientific data tells us. So what do Catholics do? They reject the science. In fact, 64% of Americans have, in a poll that was taken about 7 years ago, have said that if there was a scientific fact that was in conflict with what the religion told them, they would reject the fact rather than reject their belief. So that's 2 out of 3. I mean, and that is not a healthy attitude. So if accommodationism just doesn't work. I mean, there's varieties of it. There's the Steve Gould approach that religion doesn't make any, the Noma view that religion doesn't really make any claims about the real world, and science should let religion handle the issues of morality and meaning and values. And that fails on both counts because A, religion does make claims about the world, which are testable in some cases, like the test of the prayer, and B, meaning, morals, and values can be handled from a perfectly secular perspective, as the ancient Greeks have done and as many philosophers do today. So that's another kind of accommodationism which fails.
And I even think science can say a lot about morals.
Well, I mean, they can give us they can say a lot more about morals than people think they can. I mean, one of the people that's actively engaged in this is Franz de Waal at Emory, who's written books on the evolutionary origin of moralities. Clearly, I think a lot of our instinctive moral feelings are our desire to care for our children, and the fact that we care for those that we know best, that we have, if a friend was drowning versus a stranger, we would save the friend. That comes from our having lived in social groups where we learn to recognize and reciprocate benefits to those people we know. And of course, with our kids and our relatives, we share genes with them. And de Waal has shown that in social primates and other animals, they have behaviors that are remarkably, and also Paul Bloom at Yale has shown this.
Yeah, he just
he's
launched a book, Just Babies.
Just Babies, I actually have it sitting there. He shows that you can take very young children before they can speak or really learn anything, and they'll show sort of innate moral stimuli, just empathy, care for those that you're familiar with, a sense of fairness. There's a remarkable video on YouTube, and Blue mentioned something like this, where you have two capuchin monkeys, and that you give them, they like grapes better than they like cucumbers. You give them both grapes, and they love the grapes. Give them both cucumbers, and they'll eat the cucumbers, but they like grapes better. And then you give one of them a grape, and you give the one in the next cage a cucumber. This is a remarkable demonstration that you can see on YouTube. The monkey that gets the cucumber goes nuts because he sees the other one getting the grape. So he just throws the cucumber out of the cage, bangs on the cage, and screams. To me, that bespeaks a sort of innate sense of fairness, which the young infants have as well before they are socialized. And I think that sense of fairness is in our genes. And in that sense, then, these kind of scientific, anthropological, and developmental explorations do tell us something about morality. I mean, they can't tell us what's right. I still believe that, as opposed to Sam Harris. I don't think science can tell us how to behave. We're living in a different world now than the world in which we evolved. And so, I think, for example, I think we should be helping people in Africa to which we're not really related at all, because
I think this some Harris points that our actions matters because affects other people and other conscious creators. So I have to know what these impacts of our actions are, so we can expand the brain to make what makes people suffer.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, Sam's right. That if you have a standard of what is good and bad, then it's an empirical matter.
Yeah,
but to determine what to do, I mean, how do you weigh off different empirical matters? For example, Sam uses this as an example in his book. Do I give my daughter a birthday present, or do I donate the money to starving African children? And the right thing to do for the terms of well-being is to give that money away. In fact, it's to give away as much money as you can. Yeah, and reduce your lifestyle. But somehow we don't think that that's necessarily the right thing to do. I mean, there's the famous trolley problem, which I won't discuss as well. But that's still based on the moral judgment that well-being is the criterion for morality, that we should do what increases well-being. Well, but then you have to worry about what are we mean about well-being. How do you weigh off health versus wealth, for example? I mean, that's a judgment call, and it's a subjective judgment call. How do we weigh off being nice to our kids versus being nice to a starving African child? I mean, if you want to judge well-being as total well-being of the world versus, and then there's the well-being of society. Should we torture somebody if that's going to save 100 lives? Should we hurt them? And if you're Sam Harris, you're going to say yes. But one might say, well, yeah, but a society in which we're allowed to torture people is not a society that has as much well-being as one which we can torture people. And there's no way to adjudicate that. So many of these moral issues, even if you have a criterion, come down to sort of subjective judgments. And even Sam said, he'd prefer to get his daughter a birthday present. Maybe that means he's not a moral person. So ultimately, I think that science and empiricism has a lot more to contribute to morality than most people think it does. But I don't think that it can answer everything. Ultimately, you have to decide what you want to maximize by being moral, and that often comes down to a subjective judgment that can't be decided by science.
What's your view of philosophy, the issue between some scientists that have been commenting about philosophy and science? What's your opinion about the importance of philosophy today?
Well, I think I made this clear on my website. I think it's important in several respects. I think a lot of academic philosophy, and particularly philosophy of religion, is worthless. I mean, it has no possible effect on the average person. And of course, evolution doesn't either, but at least we find out stuff about the real world that can excite the awe and enthusiasm of people. It doesn't help people's lives on a day-to-day basis to know that birds are just the descendants of dinosaurs, but it's an exciting and rewarding thing to do. But academic philosophy, doesn't find out stuff like that because it's not an empirical discipline, and B, a lot of it is so arcane that it has no possible interest for the average person. That said, there are branches of philosophy that I think are very useful. I mean, first of all, philosophy as a whole trains you to think analytically and think logically and see logical flaws, and in that way, it's important for a scientist. The history of philosophy has dealt with many questions that I think are of importance to people's lives, like ethics, for example, is a good, um, you know, the Euthyphro argument of Plato, why why morals cannot come from God, is an absolutely dispositive argument, which is a very powerful one. And there's been a whole history of ethical arguments that I think are useful for people to know about in helping them try to think about how the right way to behave. Peter Singer, for example, or John Rawls, or even Sam Harris, who's practicing philosophy, not in many parts of his book. So I think ethical philosophy, the two real important parts of philosophy for us are ethical philosophy, which helps us think about things like abortion, how to live, euthanasia. Those kinds of issues are, deeply wedded to philosophy. And second of all, the habit of rigorous thinking, which can be instilled as philosophers, can help scientists. I mean, Dan Dennett, who is a philosopher, has written many books that are science about things like consciousness and evolution and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond those two areas, philosophy, I think, is largely a luxury, which is, I mean, not of use to a scientist, but maybe keeps philosophers in business, keeps them off the streets. But I don't know if it's of much value to the average person or even scholarship as a whole. And certainly religious philosophy I consider to be not only a waste of time, but injurious because it supports religion.
You mentioned that the values of something for the lay person. So, I mean, we are advocating for a scientific worldview. So what a lay person, average person can obtain from the scientific worldview?
From what?
Scientific worldview, a view more scientific. I mean.
Oh, everything. I mean, you gain the world. I mean, I guess you could rephrase that old quote. I don't know where it comes from, Shakespeare maybe. What does it benefit a man to gain the world if he loses his soul? I would turn that around and say you really should lose your soul, if you by soul you mean religion, because you have the world to gain. I mean, you can only really address the problems of humanity, to solve the problems of humanity by using a scientific worldview. I mean, look how much better our lives are now than they were 5 centuries ago. I mean, our lifespan has gone up from like 35 to 75. That's due to science, basically. Medicine, improvements in nutrition and crop growing and artificial selection, it's due to science. Our ability to have cell phones, our ability to have computers, to communicate, to drive cars, to go to the moon. Almost every improvement in our lives that's been affected in the last, since, science started in the 15th century, has been done by science. How much of our lives improved due to theology? I'd say none. I mean, theology has been a brake on the improvement of humanity, not an impetus. If we had only theology and religion and no science, we would be living in the Middle Ages today, because theology hasn't helped us at all, and B, it hasn't improved, it hasn't evolved. We're still using the same kind of medieval theological arguments that we had, way back when. So, science is the tool for improving lives. And by that, I mean science broadly construed, using evidence to come to conclusions. I mean, science to me includes things like plumbing and growing and car mechanics, anything and technology where you rely on empiricism rather than faith. Mm-hmm. Your conclusions. So, and global warming is a real example where we're facing a problem that could wipe out the human race. And you need to approach that scientifically, to learn if there is global warming or not. I mean, there are all these people, many of them religious, who simply deny the problem. Either them or businessmen who don't have necessarily faith in God, but faith in what's in their wallet. And so they reject it for the same reason. The recognition of that problem will come through science and climate science that measures things like emissions and affecting the atmosphere. And second of all, if there's going to be a cure for global warming before it kills us all, that's going to be through science. Yeah. So these imminent problems facing humanity. Disease is another one. The AIDS epidemic, the possibility of recurrence of, I mean, the elimination of smallpox and polio from the world was done by science, epidemiology, and vaccines. So that's why I think the average person needs to not only appreciate science but learn something about how science works, because it's useful for you in your everyday life. Well, we are scientists in our everyday life. If you're fixing your toilet, you're going to do it like a scientist. You don't just say, "Oh my God, that leak must come
Let's
from
pray
gut."
and
Yeah, no, you find there must be a pipe, and the water runs only in certain directions, so it's got to be a pipe up here or something like that. Or we trust our doctors who give us medicine, not because we have faith in our doctors in a religious way, but because we know that they have science behind them, and that science is research that shows that this pill is going to reduce your blood pressure or
yeah,
whatever.
but at some point, some people lose the rational and start to see homeopathy doctor.
Yeah, it's dangerous. I mean, I had a friend who had salivary gland cancer and tried to cure it through homeopathy, and it didn't work, of course. And the result is, well, he finally resorted to Western medicine and he was cured. But if he had done that, he would have died. And homeopathy is a form of faith because there is no evidence whatsoever that it works. They've done experiments on it. So that's I mean, it's not just religion that's a source of faith. Faith is belief without evidence, basically. Religion is the most widespread manifestation of faith, but there's other forms: homeopathy, chiropractic in many cases, belief in UFOs or Bigfoot or horoscopes or astrology or ESP are all forms of faith in the same way that religion is. And if you and if you it's really, the problem is not of religion, it's of faith, which is the basis for religious belief. And so faith is inimical in a lot of ways, but it's not limited to religion, and homeopathy is one of those ways. So
You mentioned that you're writing a book about religion and science.
hmm
And I think it's an interesting question. What do you think is the worst religion? The worst in the sense that they want the most contradictory science, or I think sells itself as a science. I mean,
well, I mean, that's two different questions. So the
yeah,
religions that sell themselves as a science, there's two of them: Christian Science and Scientology. Those are both pretty bad. Christian Science because they withhold medical care from people, because their so-called science is the work of Mary Baker Eddy, who claims that you can be cured by faith healing. And I have a book sitting right there called When Prayer Fails, which recounts all the cases of Christian Science children who have died because their parents, I mean, that's about as bad as it gets when religion, when you withhold medical care from your children because you think God tells you to. So in terms of the sort of religions that portray themselves as science, Christian Science is a bad one. Scientology is pretty bad too. They say that they're science based, but that science is so bogus. And I mean, that religion to me is like a pyramid scheme. It just bilks people out of money and to get these e-meter diagnoses, of their problems so they can get clear. But in terms of sort of in the modern world, the faith that would do the most damage or has the potential to do the most damage, I'd say it'd be a close run between Islam, which represses half of its population, i.e., women, has the doctrine to kill unbelievers, to kill gay people, to kill adulterers. There's honor killings. Now, not all Muslims practice that, but that is Muslim code, and in the Middle East, that's what's practiced. So Islam is very repressive, retrograde, and dangerous religion. And it not only has that, but it has the concept of forcible conversion, which leads to jihad, which leads to suicide bombing. Jews and Quakers don't have that kind of attitude towards their religion, that you have to convert the world. When you have that attitude, then are we running out of time here? So anyway, in terms of bad religions, it would be a close run between Islam, which I would consider probably the most dangerous religion today, and Catholicism, which is not as obviously invidious, but still represses women. It still has retrograde scientific attitudes like preventing birth control, or telling people in Africa that condoms aren't going to prevent AIDS because they want people to have lots of Catholic kids and stuff like that. And Catholicism instills its adherents with a sense of guilt, which poisons their lives, I think, makes them believe, it sours their sex lives, it makes them constantly feeling like they're going to go to hell, and that's just not good for people to be ridden with this sense of guilt on no basis whatsoever. So yeah, I mean, and I think those are the bad ones. I mean, not all religions are really bad. Some of them are almost completely innocuous, like the Quakers, for example, or the Jains or the Unitarian Universalists, because A, they don't have doctrines that are repressive, and B, they don't believe in converting people or forcing people to adhere to their religious tenets. So, in other words, they have less faith than other religions, I think. It all comes down to faith in the end. So,
Last question. Your book, Why Evolution is True, is not available here in Brazil in Portuguese. So if someone wants to translate your book and make it available over here, what these people should do?
yeah, I mean, it is published in Portuguese in Portugal. I mean, you know that. I I don't know why it's not available in Brazil. Presumably, the outfit in Portugal that publishes it, you could import. I mean, I'm sure you could order from Amazon Portugal my book in Portuguese, sitting up there on the shelf.
I don't have a problem in English. I'm reading
Yeah,
the book in English, but I mean, this is a barrier for a lot of Brazilian people, and
yeah, I
I
know.
try to make those questions. For example, part of my blog is translation. I already translated one of your texts because I try to make the text and people more accessible to Brazilian Portuguese people.
Yeah. I don't, I mean, I'm not sure what the relationship between Portugal and Brazil is in terms of getting, published material back and forth between those two countries. But, certainly it should not be hard to get my book there. But, the company that published it in Lisbon is very small, and I'm not sure they're equipped to deal with distributors in Brazil. So that, that you'd have to ask them about that. I certainly would like people to read it. Not so much for the money, but because the pedagogical aspects. And the most important thing would be to get my book translated into Arabic, because there are no books on the evidence for evolution in Arabic, and the Islam is one of the most anti-evolution religions around, which is another reason it's bad. But I think that will happen, because I think the Egyptian translation service is going to translate my book into Arabic, which should be great.
That's interesting.
You know, so as far as why it's not in Brazil, I I can't make it happen. But I think that somebody in Brazil could, if they were interested, by writing to the publisher in Portugal and saying, why can't we have your books over here? Or some Brazilian distributor writing to the Portuguese publisher and saying, we'd like to have your book. And I'm sure they would be delighted to do that. It's a small outfit. They're not rich, so. But that's not something I can do, so.
All right. I want to thank you very much for this conversation. I enjoy a lot. I will post private in YouTube and send the link to you, and you get a feedback to me if I can make it public.
Great. Well, it's my pleasure. It was enjoyable to talk to you, and best of luck.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Take care.